Hi, everyone. We're going to give people just a couple more minutes to trickle in. I know we're waiting on a few people, so just hold tight for a sec. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen and make sure that I can do all this right. All right, can you guys hear me okay? Awesome, thanks, Treva. Well, hello and welcome. I'm really excited to be talking to you about this topic. My name's Kelsey Helsper. I'm a BCBA at Bierman, and I've been with Bierman for just over 7 years. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about because I've seen how much it can impact a child and their communication. So yeah, let's get into it. So we're here to talk about why behavior happens, the functions of behavior. And you guys can all see my screen, okay? Perfect, thank you. All right, so just wanna talk through this a little bit. So how you communicate, which obviously a lot of you are doing a great job using the chat already, but I really encourage you to participate throughout this presentation. There are a few parts where I'll pause and we'll talk through some of your real life examples. And I really think that just helps relate to the content and apply it to your daily life. So let's see. Okay. Sorry, I opened up the Q&A. Okay. So yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to sharing is okay. Here we go. Sorry about that. Okay. It says my sharing is paused. Are you guys still able to see my screen? Okay, great. All right, so yeah, there are a few ways that we can communicate with each other throughout this. So using the chat, I will say, was the easiest for the last one that we did. So feel free to just post things there. But you also have the option to raise your hand if you ever want to talk aloud with the group. And there's also the Q&A button where you can post a question, and then as we get time, then we can answer those questions and go through that. So they're also in the chat. You can see that there's 2 right above where you type your message, and you can choose to post to all panelists, or you can choose, or the panelist is just me, and then you can also choose to post to the panelists and all of the attendees if you would like. So yeah. First, what we are going to do is we're going to take a poll. So you'll see the poll pop up on my screen, but I would just love to know how much ABA experience you guys all have. So I am going to launch this poll. Okay. So feel free to answer. I'll just give you guys a couple of minutes to answer. All right, for those of you just logging on, you can go ahead and answer this poll if you can see it up on your screen. All right. So it looks like most of you have more than a year of experience. So that's great, and you probably have already heard a lot about this topic. But we can just dive into it a little deeper. But glad to have you all here. Okay. So there you guys can see the results too. Okay, so our objectives for this training. So we are going to define the ABCs of behavior, and we'll talk about what that means. We're also going to identify the role function plays in behavior. We're going to identify the 4 functions of behavior that we practice in ABA. And then we are going to identify how to appropriately respond to challenging behaviors. So let's learn the ABCs. So A stands for antecedent, and that just means all the things that come right before the behavior. So these could be the things that trigger the behavior to happen. So some examples of these could be Henry's mom gets a phone call and begins talking and walking into the other room. So that's something that could happen right before the target behavior happens. Another thing that could be an antecedent could be Lucy is playing with blocks with her younger brother, and then he comes over and knocks them over. And then Jeremiah's mom asks him to come brush his teeth. So we'll go into some of your real life examples. Maybe you can relate to some of these that we've listed, but all of these things can be things that happen that trigger a challenging behavior. So let's talk about what behavior stands for. So B is for behavior. So that is what the person does. And this could be absolutely anything. If we do it, it counts as behavior. So going along with the previous examples from the antecedent, Henry screams and throws his toys across the room. Lucy hits her brother, or Jeremiah runs into the other room to play with his toys. So when labeling, oh, thank you for pointing that out. Let's see. I'm going to stop share for a minute. Oh, here we go. Does that help? Did that do anything? It's still stuck. Okay. And let's take a poll. Okay. I'm going to stop share and then let's see. I can come right back to it. All right. What are you guys seeing now? Good now. Okay, perfect. Okay, so behavior is what a person does. All of those behaviors that were listed, so Henley screaming and throwing toys, Lucy hitting her brother, Jeremiah running into the other room, those are all behaviors that we can observe and we can measure. So it is really important when we think about labeling the behavior to focus on what it is that we can observe. For example, if you were to say that your child engages in tantrums, while that's very accurate and you're probably correct, the best way to really get a good picture of what that looks like is to really define those behaviors separately. So the word tantrum could include a lot of different behaviors like crying, whining, kicking, flopping. So you can see that if we were just recording something for tantrum, it would be really hard for multiple people to really know what that means. So the better we can define it, the better, because then everybody can be on the same page about what we're looking for, and we'll be able to track data consistently and really know what we're trying to change in the behavior. Okay, can you guys see this next screen? C is for consequence. Perfect. Okay. So C is for consequence. So that is anything that happens right after the behavior. So it's really important when we look at the behavior to see what happened before and what happened after, because those are the parts that are going to tell us why the behavior could be happening. So the word consequence kind of gets a bad rep, but in this scenario, it does not mean that it has to be negative. It could be receiving a reward for doing something really well. It could also be having a task removed that's too hard, or anything in between. So, consequence does not mean something negative happens. It simply means whatever it was, positive or negative, that happened right after the behavior. So, going along with those same examples, here are some examples of consequences. So, Henry's mom stops her conversation to come in and say, "What do you want?" Her brother runs to tell their mom, and Lucy is left to play with her blocks alone. And Jeremiah's mom brushes his sister's teeth first before asking him to brush his teeth again. So, I want to put all of these together and talk about what's happening here and what you guys think might happen in the future because of either the antecedent or the consequence. So, we're going to talk through the first example. So, Henry's mom gets a phone call and begins talking and walking into the other room. After that happens, Henry screams and throws his toys across the room. And then Henry's mom stops her conversation to come in and say, "What do you want?" So you can see by this example and by writing it out like this, you can see that Henry is probably um, trying to get his mom's attention. And by his mom stopping her phone call and coming to ask him what he wants, she is actually reinforcing the screaming and throwing because he's getting what he wants out of it. So the next time that Henry wants attention, it's likely that he might engage in the screaming and the throwing because that ultimately gave him the consequence that he was looking for. Okay, let's talk about number 2, and then I'll have you guys type in the chat what you think about this behavior. So, Lucy is playing with blocks when her younger brother comes over and knocks them over. Lucy then hits her brother, and her brother runs to tell their mom, and Lucy is left to play with her blocks alone again. So, what do you think is going to happen the next time that Lucy wants to play alone? Yep. So I'm going to read some of the answers coming in. So she will hit her brother. Um, she will hit her brother. So, yes, you guys are right on the money. So you can see that by writing all of this out, you get a really clear picture of exactly what happened. And then you can start to identify patterns in that behavior. So you can see here, Lucy is likely to hit her brother again when she wants to be left alone because that got her what she wanted the last time. Her brother left to go do something else or to go tell mom. So, lastly, Jeremiah's mom asks him to come brush his teeth. Jeremiah runs into the other room to play with his toys. And then Jeremiah's mom brushes his sister's teeth first before asking him to brush his teeth again. So, different question here. So, what do you think Jeremiah is trying to get out of this situation? Yep, somebody said more time to play. Yep. So I think it's easy to assume that he was probably doing something preferred whenever mom asked him um, to come to the room and brush his teeth. So really here, and why I wanted to provide an example like this is the function could be multiple things. So Jeremiah could just want more time with his toys, but somebody also said he could be avoiding brushing his teeth. So maybe it doesn't matter what he's doing in the moment. Maybe every time mom asks to come and brush teeth, he just does not want to do that. So um, that's the importance of writing ABC data down, is because it really gives us that clear picture of why it could be happening. So to reiterate on that a little bit, so it's all about the data. So collecting data on the ABCs, just like what I showed you, it really helps us to identify those patterns in behavior and helps us to understand what the function actually is. So if we can identify something that is consistently triggering a behavior to happen, we'll be able to teach your child how to work through it in a more appropriate way. For example, if your child has trouble with loud noises, let's say, and let's say the school is about to do a fire drill where the alarm's going to go off, then your child is likely going to engage in some challenging behavior because they hear that loud noise. So if you can identify that the fire alarm is a trigger, or just any loud noise in general is a trigger, then the next time that you know something like that could happen, you could try to anticipate those things, and you could try to be proactive about the way you deal with them. So um, maybe you could ask, hey, can you just give us a heads up before we do the fire drill next time? Or you can remove your child from that environment if you really don't think they'll be able to tolerate it. So there are things we can do in the antecedent or before the behavior happens to help set them up for success. Um, yes, yeah. So I can definitely write out, or I can definitely speak up. Sorry, John asked or mentioned that unless everyone is using all panelists and attendees, then attendees can't see what others are texting. So it is up to you if you want that to be visible to everyone or just to me. So I'll just try to do a better job of explaining what people are writing in the chat. Thanks for pointing that out. Um, Okay, so triggers can be identified by using this ABC data, but also similarly, it can help us to identify signals of more challenging behavior. And what I mean by that are sometimes our children engage in more mild behaviors before they engage in more dangerous or more intense challenging behavior. So, for example, if your child cries and screams before hitting you or throwing objects, then we could identify crying and screaming as the behavior that is the signal. And then we can try to intervene during those behaviors before the behavior escalates to those higher magnitude behaviors. But also, if we identify that a behavior is occurring frequently, we might be able to adjust the way that we respond to it. So that's more talking about the consequence. So to make sure that we are not providing any reinforcement for a behavior that we don't want to encourage. So, so how do you know if you're providing reinforcement? If the behavior is increasing over time, then you know your child in that scenario is likely getting what they want um, out of that scenario. But if it's decreasing, then they may not be getting what they want, or if nothing's really happening. So really, it just helps us to pay attention to what we're doing and what role we play in the behavior. And it really just helps us to make decisions about how we want to respond to that as well. Okay, so it is time for another poll. Let me open it up here. So I would love to know, how much experience do you have with collecting ABC data, especially since we have several people who have had services for a year or more? All right. So it looks like the majority of you have never collected ABC data. So I would encourage you to maybe try it at home, especially if you're really struggling to identify why your child is engaging in those behaviors. But a few of you have had some experience. So I really find it to be a really helpful way in determining why something might be happening. So especially if you feel like you're getting stuck at home, this can just be a great way. Writing it down can be a great way to help you kind of work through the behavior. Okay. So Susan, I wanted you to know I saw your question, but I'm going to save it for a slide that we're going to talk about that exact thing later. Okay, can everybody see? I want to make sure that my computer doesn't do that again. Can you see that it's on the tips and tricks slide? Perfect. Okay, so some tips and tricks to dealing with the ABCs of challenging behavior are to really focus on what you can see. So don't guess what might have happened, just write down exactly what you saw. It's good to be really objective, and it's good to just write down exactly the facts of everything because you might think you know what triggered it or what was going on. But if you just write down exactly what you see, then you might actually realize that there's a pattern in something else that's happening. Also, when we're talking about antecedents, you don't want to think too far back in the past. So, meaning an antecedent is gave him homework, not he woke up cranky and told me 5 times he didn't want to do his homework today. So, you really want to think about what just happened right before the behavior started and not, he's had a really bad morning and, he woke up in a bad mood. All of those things, while they could potentially be affecting it, it's likely that something happened right before that triggered the behavior to happen. And then when writing consequences, write down exactly what happened and as many details as you can think of that would be applicable, like who it was, what environment you were in, anything like that, the specific toy that they were playing with. So I will say too, it's tempting to write what you think you should have done or how you should have responded to the behavior, but it's really important to just write down exactly what happened, even if you think there could have been a better way that you could have approached your consequence. But writing it down and writing exactly what happened will help you to identify maybe the pattern in your own behavior and the way that you respond to that behavior. And it'll show you, by looking at all of that and recognizing that pattern, then you'll be able to come up with a better way the next time. So it's great that you can, if you're thinking about writing what you should have done or how it could have gone better, it's great that you're already identifying those things. But it is really important in the moment to identify the current patterns of behavior so you are able to change the next time. Okay, so I really want to practice some of this. So in the chat, I want you to try to think of an incident that happened at home with your child this week. So, and if your child doesn't engage in challenging behavior weekly, then maybe just think about the most current challenging behavior episode that you can. But you can just label antecedent and write what that was, behavior, write what that was, and then consequence and write what that was. But if you guys could spend a couple minutes in the chat and just write out some examples, I would love to just talk through some of those things. And make sure to include the antecedent behavior and consequence whenever you guys are writing these. So I'll share the first example. So it's time to get ready for school. I'm assuming the direction was placed to get dressed. So it sounds like a lot of trouble to get dressed, wrestling to get the clothes on, and am a sweaty mess. I have two young boys, so I can relate to this example very much. So, yeah, that can be a really tricky one. But you can probably identify if this is it has become your new morning routine, that getting dressed or giving the direction to get dressed is a trigger. So, trying to think of some ways that you can proactively get ahead of that would be maybe practice getting dressed at other times of the day. So maybe you have like a dress up bin and you guys practice, independence with getting dressed throughout the day, or maybe you think about what your reward is for completing that task. So maybe they know that that's a really hard task for them, but you're rushing out the door, you're trying to get everybody ready, and you're not even really providing reinforcement for that. So you could think about potentially reserving some type of reward or reinforcement for that task that motivates them to want to do it more. Another example here is my daughter always asks for Oreos. I tell her no. She then yells, does not want to eat anything else. So I have to give her one. So she eats everything else. Um, so really in that example, it's great that you've already identified that Oreos can be a reinforcer for her to eat the rest of the food. I would just encourage you to say, if you say no to the Oreos, you can say, okay, look, I have the Oreos here. We're going to eat this and then you get Oreos. So really, instead of reinforcing the yelling, you would be getting ahead of the behavior and you would be showing her what's available as her reinforcer or her reward. And then you can use that to encourage her positive behavior of eating those foods. Um, okay, so grandson is eating lunch, trying to introduce new food. Um, Grandson throws food on the floor. And then food on the floor is thrown away. So that's a great real life example too, because I feel like as any parent or grandparent, we've all been there. But you can see the consequence of throwing the food away after it's been on the floor is likely showing him, oh, I know if I throw this on the floor, I'm not going to have to eat it. So he gets out of that task. So that's a really tricky one because obviously you don't really want your kiddos or your grandkids eating off the floor. But I would say maybe think of a way that you can control the food or have the food under your control. Maybe you're putting the food on the fork and you're kind of spoon feeding or fork feeding them so they're not able to throw the food on the floor. And then really you can try to practice more independence with like utensils and stuff like that with foods that they prefer. But I would say if it's foods that they don't prefer, then maybe try to do it that way where you're more in control of the food item so that they aren't getting out of doing it that way. Okay. So, and sometimes too, which I'm glad one of you brought this up. So, someone said I cannot point out antecedents, and sometimes it's really hard to do. Sometimes you can't really identify exactly what it was. So really, that's another great benefit to writing stuff down because in the moment you can more clearly think back to what just happened. And if you can write those down a few times in a row, you might be able to see that, you leaving the room or a certain sound turning on or something could be triggering. But the rest of that is he will just start whining and crying out of nowhere. And I start asking him if he wants food or drink, but nothing helps. And so get frustrated, start hitting himself and anyone who tries to calm him down. So yeah, that's really tricky that it goes, to a really high magnitude really quickly. So yeah, I would say really writing stuff down would help so that you can start to identify some of those antecedents. And yeah, if you notice that asking him, like talking to him in those moments when he's really upset is triggering him to escalate his behavior, then it might be a good idea to just wait him out. And something that I've done with some of my clients who have uh, engaged similarly in that like escalation is I have tried just like presenting things without vocalizing what I'm presenting. So, just showing them some options without actually saying anything. Because sometimes I've noticed in those situations, if they're already upset, me trying to talk to them is triggering. So, it could be that that's the case. It could be that it's not. But I would say just maybe try to adjust your approach and see if anything, works a little better in that regard. Okay, here's another one. So BTs are trying a new program that my daughter dislikes because it's hard. They ask her to answer the question. She flops to the floor and whines and cries, and they continue asking the question so they don't reward her behavior. We fight our instincts to just switch up what we're doing so she calms down. Yeah, that's really tricky. And introducing new skills is so tricky too because we're already expecting them all day long to, be really engaged all day long and learning all these new things. And it's hard, and learning new things is hard. But um, obviously, we have to kind of push through that a little bit. But I would say you could approach this proactively too from the antecedent. And if it's likely that when they introduce something new that her behavior does kind of escalate like this, then it might just be that we need to find better motivation for her for those hard skills. So that could be reserving something for teaching something new, like one of her favorite toys or one of her favorite food items or something like that, that she gets that after every new hard task that she does. Um, or I would say if it's really something that's difficult for her, we could try to teach her to communicate. I'm not sure how she communicates, but whether that be, showing her a picture and having her touch it, vocally saying, I don't want to, or I need help, something like that, encouraging appropriate communication or, um, you know, looking at her motivation might really help her. And at least it ensures that we are um, reinforcing something that is appropriate rather than something that is not appropriate. Okay, so another one is he's playing in his room with his older brother. He hits or throws things at his older brother, and his brother yells that it hurt him and leaves to tell parents. So I'm assuming this one might be like one of the examples that I shared. So, or it sounds like they're playing together, and maybe brother did something that wasn't desirable for him and starts to hit or throw. It would probably be a good idea, to ask brother if you can, what happened, or start to try to figure out what the antecedent could be, and get more detail about that. But then if he wants to, if he wants his brother to leave and his brother does leave to go, tell on him or anything like that, then you can see that he is contacting reinforcement for that. So I would say if it's something that happens frequently, it might be a good idea to kind of facilitate that interaction a little bit and maybe even try to coach brother in ways to respond to him and to try to help him through some of those scenarios would be a good idea. And then last one. So he was told it was past his bedtime, go to bed, and he kept playing his game, saying he was trying to finish the level. Got an attitude. So, with saying got an attitude, it might just be good to really define what that looks like. So, is that like verbally protesting your direction, or is that like whining or crying? Um, and then his dad came out to the living room then took the Wii from the living room and put it in the bedroom. Yes, and that's a great example. So he has to go to bed. That's a non-negotiable task that he has to do. He kept playing his game, so obviously he wasn't following through with that direction. Um, and then the item was removed. I'm assuming he probably was pretty mad after that. Um, and I would say whatever the behavior was after that would probably be the behavior we're looking for um, out of him, because once something is removed, I'm assuming he probably got pretty upset about it and maybe engaged in some challenging behavior. But you removed that item. And as long as you didn't give the item back after, he started to engage in some like crying or whining or verbal protest or anything like that, then it sounds like you were doing the right thing. So I hope that was helpful in talking through some of those things. We're going to keep diving into the content, but I do have a couple more sections where we're going to be able to share some more and dive more into that. But if I didn't answer any of your questions, or if you have more or would like more feedback on that, then just type that in the chat and I'd be happy to come back to it. Okay, so let's talk more about the function of behavior. So the function is why we do what we do. In ABA, that is what we focus on. So you can understand this as the cause of the behavior. So when we talk about function versus form, let's talk about the difference. So the form, or you might hear it called topography, we use that verbiage a lot, but those are the physical attributes of the behavior. So exactly like you guys were defining to me. So hitting, crying, screaming, all of those things are the physical form of the behavior. And while those are really important to identify and look at, really we try to focus on the function, because the function is going to help us to change the behavior and give a replacement behavior for what we want to happen next. So the function is obviously why the behavior happens. So in ABA, we focus more on why the behavior happens rather than what the behavior looks like, even though we do identify both of those things. Okay, so talking more about the role of function. So our children are often attempting to obtain cool things or get out of something that they don't want to do. So it's our job to determine what it is that they're wanting. So whatever that thing is that they want, that's the function. So you guys gave a lot of great examples of that. So whether it be denying access to something that they want, presenting a hard task, all of those things are the function. So they're either typically trying to get out of something, trying to get more access to something, trying to get your attention. So we'll talk more about those separate functions in a minute. But like we realized in some of these examples that you guys provided, sometimes it's easy to figure out and sometimes it's really not. So that is why it is so important to write those things down and to be able to identify the things in writing that maybe in the moment you can't really see. And then I just liked this little visual. So if you're given a task you don't want to do, just start crying. They'll send you straight to the thinking chair. It's like a vacation from work. So, really in a kid's mind, maybe they're not actually thinking that specific thing, but their wheels are turning, their brains are working and figuring out how they can manipulate the situation to fit their needs. So it is really important to think about how we are responding to the behavior so that we can make sure that we are reinforcing something that we want to see continue. Okay, so let's talk about the 4 functions. So escape is one of them. So an example of escape could be whining every time you ask them to brush their teeth or asking to take a break from homework. So really you can see I provided a couple examples because it's not only challenging behavior that has a function, it's also appropriate behavior that has a function. So whining, the whining here is trying to escape brushing their teeth, but asking to take a break is a very appropriate behavior that they can engage in to escape a task. So you can see, we may just shift their behavior to be more appropriate, like asking to take a break or asking appropriately to get out of something. Um, and then we may honor that if they are doing something appropriate. But it could also mean just delaying or avoiding an activity. So, like one of you brought up the getting dressed, they're probably just trying to avoid that as long as they can. So, even though they know it's going to happen. But yeah, escape can be a very, very common function that we see. Attention is also another one. So, an appropriate way to get someone's attention could be saying, "Look at me." Another inappropriate way to get attention could be hitting a sibling to get you to come into the room. Um, Access. So, we also use the word tangible a lot. So, access to a tangible item. So, tangible just meaning something that, they can hold, they can touch. So some examples of that would be pointing to a food that they want in the cabinet. So I'm not sure how your kiddos communicate. I'm sure it's kind of across the board, but pointing can be a way that they're trying to communicate their needs. So pointing to something that they want in the cabinet could be a really appropriate way for them to get something that they want. An inappropriate way could be grabbing a toy out of another child's hand without asking. So, but you can see that both of those are functioning because they want access to something. And then the last one, which this to me is the hardest to identify, and your children may be engaging in some of this behavior. Um, so, really, I mostly see this as like body rocking, tapping hands against item, flapping hands. That like self-stimulatory behavior is a lot of the times automatically maintained. So, really, they're not trying to get anything out of it. They're not really trying to get more access or your attention or anything. They're just automatically reinforced by that motion or that feeling. So with those, sometimes the function just isn't clear. They're more so doing it to self-soothe or to get that sensory input. Okay, so let's take our last poll. All right. So I just want to know, is the function of your child's behavior easy for you to identify or not? All right. So it looks like most are mostly able to figure out their child's challenging behavior. So that's a really good thing. Um, like I've mentioned multiple times now, but if you are having a really hard time, writing it down can be a really helpful thing to do. But also, I would love, as we share some more examples, for you guys to mention some of those exact behaviors that you are struggling to identify so that we can talk through them and try to come up with some solutions. Okay, so why is function so important? We've really talked a lot about this already, but identifying the function of an undesirable behavior can help us to determine an appropriate replacement behavior that can serve the same function. So, an example, if your child screams every time they want a cracker, obviously that is access to tangible. They're trying to access something. We could teach him or her to point to that item, to say the name of that item, to show a picture of that item. What we do to replace that behavior is going to depend on your child's communication style. So we're going to try to prompt whatever is best for them and easiest for them. And then over time, withholding the cracker when your child screams and only giving the cracker following an appropriate request will help the screaming behavior to decrease. So, once we identify what an appropriate replacement behavior should be, so we don't want them to cry and scream to get a cracker anymore. Now we're only going to accept the point or, saying, I want cracker, or pushing that button on their device. So we're no longer going to provide reinforcement when they scream. We're just going to prompt them to engage in that behavior that we already taught them. So this can really be done with any behavior we want to see increase. So let's practice again. So in the chat, I want you, like I said, I really want to go through some of those behaviors that are tricky for you guys, and try to label that behavior, followed by what you think the function of the behavior is. And if you don't know, just say that. And then I would also like for you to say with that how your child communicates so that I can give you some more appropriate replacement behaviors. So let's just try to think of some. And if you can think of some on your own already, go ahead and type those in too. Okay, so this is a really good one. So it says, my grandson verbally says, help me for everything. Then you have to figure out what it is that he needs or wants. So yeah, that's great that he has learned to say, help me, but you can see that that's a really general request. So something that might, be really important is help me. And then you can just give him one action. So like help me open or help me, uh, I'm trying to think of another one, but or you could label it with that item. So help me toy. So it could just be adding on to that, and it sounds like he's already really good about asking for help. So you might just kind of pause when he asks for help, and you could even hold up, two items that you think that it is, and say, "Okay, help me what?" And maybe he points to the item or he says the item's name, maybe he says toy. So you could say, help me toy. And then if he repeats you, then you can reinforce that behavior rather than reinforcing his more generalized help me request. But what you want to be careful with that one, since it is help me is an appropriate thing to be asking. You want to make sure that if you do start to teach something new or start to withhold that reinforcement for the just help me response, that you make sure, that you don't start to see some of like some more intense challenging behavior happen because he's getting frustrated. So there is a fine line there. But I would say too, if he's in ABA services, that they're probably doing some of those strategies in the center. So I would just ask, his BCBA or his BTs what they're doing in the center to help with that, and maybe see if you can get some more specific training on how to prompt some of those things. Okay. Okay. So this one, it sounds like they're really having a hard time, even in the center, identifying why the tantrums are whining or are occurring. Um, so yeah, that can be really tricky. My biggest advice would be to start writing things down. And I'm sure they're doing that already in the center. And it may just mean getting really detailed about it as well, like where he is, who else was in the environment, what he was playing with or doing at the time. All of those things might really help you to identify if there's a pattern. Um, and then somebody said that their grandson is the same, I think, about the first example. Um, Okay, this one says my son will want to get picked up sometimes to get something, but will also point. So, yeah, really, if he's getting picked up because the thing that he wants is high or he can't reach it, I feel like that's pretty appropriate for them to want to get closer to the item. But I would definitely just continue encouraging that point. What I've seen with children who point a lot. At things is sometimes their point can get a little sloppy. So if they start to reach instead of point, I would just make sure that you're really consistently encouraging that point. And something that your BCBA may be considering if they're getting really good at pointing is introducing some type of picture communication. So showing pictures of what they want rather than just pointing to the item. Or a device. So I would just think about ways that you can continue to expand, on their vocabulary and their communication. Okay, this one says my daughter and son don't request help, food or drink. They will both start to verbally cry when they can't access a toy or are hungry. Um, my daughter can be redirected to ask for help by prompting, but my son's not quite verbal yet, and it's hard. Okay, yeah, that is such a common thing. I feel like so. Really, I love that you've already identified ways to prompt your daughter. So it sounds like asking for help. You can continue to prompt that. And that's great if she responds to that and you can help to de-escalate a little bit. Something you could also do if you can anticipate it a little bit, so you can tell she's starting to get hungry, or she always goes for this item at when she's in this room, you can just proactively maybe give her a statement of like, remember, you can ask for help if you need it, or something like that, so that the challenging behavior doesn't happen. So that's an example of how you could anticipate that trigger and modify it to set her up for success. With your son, maybe think about encouraging a point, pointing for the item or introducing. I'm not sure how he communicates in the center or if he's even getting services yet, but you may just talk to your BCBA and figure out what they think might be the best mode of communication for him to see what like how you can prompt him to communicate better. But giving him a simple sign like the sign for help, or printing off a picture that says help and having him point to it. Those could both be good options if you don't really know which way to go. Another one, so when I pass by a store that she remembers going into to get candy, she yells and screams wanting to go into that store. When we're just passing by, she'll pull me or flop to the floor until we go in to buy something. Many times I continue to pass by, but she continues to cry and scream until I can distract her. Yeah, that can be super tricky too. And especially, even if you gave in that one time and you were like, okay, I can't handle this today. We are just going to go in and get that candy. Um, that one time of you not following through with that could be fueling her to know that it could happen again. So, really, I would just say being really consistent with your follow through of not going in will really help her. But also, you can think about, so you said here that you distract her with something else. You could think about, like, oh, I know we're going to be driving past the store. I know we're going to be walking past this. I'm going to have a few things with me that she really likes. So it could be, her favorite treat or a piece of candy or a toy. And if she walks by calmly, you can give her that thing. If she doesn't walk by calmly, she doesn't get it. So I would say just really try to figure out what's going to motivate her and use that to help her through that challenging time. Okay. My son does whine when he is having screen time on the iPad and throws a fit when it dies. And your son is nonverbal. So yeah, that can be really tricky too, because that's something one that can be hard to anticipate. The iPad could just die. But also, that's something that is kind of out of your control. I would say, giving him a warning like, hey, there's this much battery left, or, this much time, or it's going to die in 1 minute, could maybe help him to know that his time is coming or it's ending. Um, I would say maybe just offering other choices of things that he can have if it does die too. So, hey, I know your iPad died. That stinks, but here we can have, this or this, and giving him some choices, and then just asking or requiring him to ask for those things appropriately. So, whether that be a point or a reach or whatever it may be. But I would just say the most important thing is to make sure that you are not reinforcing a negative behavior. So always, always just try to think about, okay, they're screaming right now, but what could I get them to do that I want, that I want to see, whether it be a point, a reach, something as simple as that. Anything that's going to be appropriate, because we just don't want to reinforce those challenging behaviors, because then we're just going to see them increase or just remain the same. They're going to be pretty frequent, and they're going to do it, almost every time that they want to access whatever function they're trying to access. All right. Thank you guys so much for sharing. So, what happens next? So, once we understand what the challenging behavior looks like, when it happens, why, then it's time to reward them for doing something socially desirable. So, the reward you provide, or we call it reinforcement, it's up to you, what you want that to be. The only critical component of that is that it should be something preferred for them. So, obviously, if you're giving them whatever's convenient for you in the moment and not really thinking about what's actually motivating for them, then it's probably not going to be a good reinforcer or reward, because they may or may not be motivated by it. So I would say the key with thinking about what your reward should be is that you're making sure that it's preferred and that it's something that they're going to really want. Also, like we just talked about, be consistent and persevere through it. It may take some time to learn the new behavior. So just think about, they've spent a long time practicing the old undesirable one. So, for some kids, maybe it's weeks, maybe it's months, maybe it's years that they've spent practicing this behavior to get what they want. So it is going to take some time and some patience to get through it. It may get worse before it gets better, if they are used to getting reinforcement for their negative behaviors. But just try really hard not to get discouraged. Because even if it does get worse before it gets better, it's likely that that is showing you that you are withholding that reinforcement for the negative behavior, and that you are doing the right thing. So we term that as an extinction burst. So an extinction being they are not getting reinforcement for that behavior anymore. It's on extinction. So the best way to get through it is to just remain consistent with your approach, and hopefully, soon and over time, you will see that that behavior starts to decrease. And then just some things to remember real quick here. So your number one priority is just to figure out patterns in the behavior. What happens right before the antecedent, what the behavior looks like, and what happens after the consequence. So identifying those things can be really helpful and can show you, why a behavior is happening. Once you determine those patterns, you can start to teach your child a new behavior that will result in the same thing. So you want to pay attention to that function, and you want to make sure that you're matching that with something that's going to get them the same function. So remember, your child is trying to tell us what they want, and now it's your goal to make sure that they get it through doing something desirable. And then once you're able to understand causes of the old behavior and teach new behavior, your child will ultimately become happier, will be able to more easily communicate. You'll probably be happier as well. It's a win-win for everybody because we're teaching that really great communication, and also we're teaching them, that those behaviors aren't appropriate. All right, so I know it is 9 o'clock, but if you guys do want to stay on, and if you have any questions, please, I can stay on, and please feel free to ask them. Okay, this one is, our son is currently dealing with ODD, so we really have to try to push and nag him to try to do schoolwork, do what he was asked to do. He will sit there, not respond, and not start working on it. Yeah, gosh, and that can be really hard. When you're trying to get him to do something, I would say really, if you don't have a reinforcer or something that he's working toward, I would really say to start there. So really think about how you can motivate him, because a hard task is a hard task, and it's just not going to be easy. So we really just want to think about ways that we can increase their motivation to do something, even if we have to use something extra. But that's where I would start, especially since you've already identified that as being, a trigger, and that would be the function to escape it. I can certainly make the PowerPoint available to you guys. I can send that off and make sure that somebody sends that to you guys. I would be happy to. Yeah, and thank you guys. If you have to get off, thank you for participating. I really enjoyed talking to you about this, and I hope you learned something. Okay, I'm going to answer this last one. So, is it bad to give a favorite item to distract or avoid a behavior? So, I would say just really try to use the favorite items as the reward for something good. So if they haven't engaged in the challenging behavior yet, but you're just kind of showing them their options of what they can do, I wouldn't say that's bad. So maybe you can provide me with a specific example, but if I'm thinking through this correctly, like if you're saying, hey, we're gonna have to turn the TV off really soon, but remember, we can go and play with blocks, or we can go to the park. If you're saying those things before the challenging behavior happens, then that isn't necessarily a bad thing. You're really just kind of helping them remember their options, and keeping them from engaging in that challenging behavior. So his teachers are using game time on his iPad as a motivator while at school. So that's perfect. That's great. And hopefully, if that is something that continues to motivate him, that you'll start to see that he's less resistant to that schoolwork and stuff. But if you do start to see that, that's not working as well anymore, it might just be a time to try to adjust whatever you're using and try to find something more motivating. My son does not use his talking apps as often as I would like at home. That's really tricky too. And honestly, I've been there with some other parents, where they use the device pretty frequently in the center, but then when they're at home, they're kind of refusing it. It can be really hard. They're having to use it all day, and then I think they can kind of understand, as parents, you can probably anticipate so much for them that they want or they need. So I would just say try to set aside, some structured time to use it. Maybe you could set a timer and say, hey, okay, for 30 minutes, we're going to use your iPad to talk, and then we'll get a break. But I would just keep trying to build it in. And again, I would try to use reinforcement. So think about how you can reward them for using it, especially when they do so by themselves independently. Just try to really think about those rewards and what they're actually getting out of doing that hard task. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. Really, the key takeaways are already stuff that we've talked about. So remembering your ABCs, collecting data, identifying the function, replacement behavior, and then just making sure to reinforce the good and stop reinforcing the negative stuff. But I appreciate all of you guys. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to meet with me. Hope you guys have a great day and happy Thanksgiving.